All right, family, pull up a chair, because what just exploded through the corporate backbone of the music world is not a rap rivalry. It is not a diss record. It is not a shady social media dig. What just unfolded is a complete destruction dressed in a sharp suit, sealed at a boardroom table, and stamped in red across the entire hip-hop financial system. And by the time you finish watching this, you will understand why every executive sitting in every glass building across Manhattan, Miami, Atlanta, Los Angeles, and London is quietly shutting their office doors and wiping their weekend schedules clean. Because Curtis 50 Cent Jackson did not simply fire another shot at Rick Ross. He constructed a machine. He constructed a machine that devours careers. And Rick Ross strolled directly into it wearing a custom suit on a Tuesday with the whole culture watching in crystal clear definition. Now, pause for a moment because I already know what you are about to say. You are about to say, this is just the same tired feud. This is 2008 Officer Ricky nonsense. This is two grown men who should have left this behind years ago. I hear you. I understand that argument. But you need to grasp something, and I am going to say this loud enough for the very back row to catch it. The 50 Cent who came after Rick Ross in 2008 no longer exists. That version of him was a rapper. The 50 Cent standing over Rick Ross's industry-wide collapse in 2026 is not a rapper. He is a media powerhouse with distribution partnerships attached to his identity at Netflix, Starz, Lionsgate, and several international content platforms. He is on speed dial with executives who could not name 3 Rick Ross singles if their career depended on it. He sits in production meetings where the phrase unit economics comes up far more frequently than the phrase Hot 16. And the man he just moved against is not the same Rick Ross who released Trilla and Deeper Than Rap either. That version had label support. He had radio. He had chart positions. The Rick Ross bleeding out on the floor right now is a legacy artist with under 2,000 first-week album sales, a tour running below 20% capacity, and you are going to want to be seated for this one, a debt portfolio that was quietly purchased by his greatest enemy. I have the paper trail to back it up. I have the venue reports. I have the corporate filings. Stay right here because what surfaced inside a Florida corporate registry filing at 5:45 Eastern today completely redraws the map of who truly controls hip-hop. And it does it without a single new verse being laid down. Not one, not a bar, not a hook. Just a stamp, a filing fee, and a lawyer gripping a black pen. Let me frame this properly because if you do not grasp how the ground shifted beneath Rick Ross's feet, nothing that follows is going to land the way it deserves to. Deeply unsettling things have been unfolding around Maybach Music Group for the past 90 days, and not one mainstream music journalist connected the pieces until right now. Rick Ross launched his 12th studio album with the swagger of a man who believed he was still operating 15 years in the past. He structured the rollout around a grand orchestral world tour, major arenas, upscale dinner jacket branding, and private jet flex content. Rick Ross framed this as his triumphant return to the throne, and for roughly 72 hours the illusion held firm. Then the first week numbers leaked. Under 2,000 pure sales. Read that again carefully. Under 2,000. A man who used to push 180,000 copies out of the gate is now moving fewer units than a suburban SoundCloud artist riding a viral TikTok moment. And that number hitting the internet was not the catastrophe. That number landing inside a specific executive email inbox at G-Unit Film and Television was the catastrophe. Because Curtis Jackson has been sitting on this particular file for 17 years, waiting for the precise set of circumstances the universe just dropped in his lap. You feel that? Because this is where most people completely misread the situation. Most people believe 50 Cent is petty. He is not petty. He is disciplined. That is the fundamental distinction Rick Ross overlooked for a decade and a half. 50 Cent has been quietly accumulating leverage. Rick Ross has been posting jet ski content. When the venue reports began arriving showing arenas at 19, 20, and 22% capacity, front row seats being papered with discounted promotional codes, Curtis Jackson did not laugh. Curtis Jackson shut his laptop, walked into a legal strategy meeting, and issued a single directive. Not a diss record, not an internet meme, a directive. And from that directive, the entire music industry landscape began rerouting itself around Rick Ross the way a river roots around a boulder. Because 50 Cent no longer needs to defeat Rick Ross on a song. Curtis Jackson has been in the business of purchasing floors, the ground you stand on, the ground you walk across, the ground where you sign your agreements. And when you hold the floor, the man standing on it already belongs to you. He is already inventory. He is already a line item on someone else's financial sheet. He just has not figured that out yet. So here is where the entire situation pivots. On Tuesday morning, before most executives had poured their first cup of coffee, a series of private legal notices went out from Curtis Jackson's corporate counsel to the boards of 3 major distribution networks, 2 international venue conglomerates, and 1 dominant streaming platform. The letters were not threats. The letters were reminders. Reminders that G-Unit Film and Television's multi-year, multi-title production pipeline, which is currently supporting a considerable portion of the streaming and premium cable ecosystem, could be reconsidered if those same partners continue to distribute, promote, host, or amplify Rick Ross's catalog and touring operations. Read that sentence slowly and deliberately, because the language is doing far more work than any diss track ever could. He did not instruct them to drop Rick Ross. He asked them to choose, and when you are a boardroom sitting on a 9-figure content partnership with Curtis on one side and a sub-2000 first-week album on the other, that calculation is not a math problem. That calculation is a formality. There is not a single executive in that building who is going to shield Rick Ross's tour dates at the cost of their own production lineup. Not one. Now let me pull back the curtain on what unfolded next, because the velocity of the collapse is the real headline here. By 10:00 that same morning, an internal memo leaked from a major international venue booking agency. 3 arena dates on Rick Ross's European and domestic tour route were placed on administrative hold pending, quote, a comprehensive operational and financial risk evaluation. Venue underwriters cited insufficient advance ticket movement and elevated operational liability, which is the professional corporate way of saying, we are not absorbing a financial loss on a man Curtis Jackson just quietly blacklisted. The dominoes did not fall one by one. The dominoes fell all at once. Streaming playlist placements began vanishing silently from Rick Ross's new album by midday. Programming executives stopped answering calls. Radio spins locked in for the weekend became unlocked. Sync deals and active discussions went completely cold. And by 2:00 in the afternoon, William Leonard Roberts' II had transformed from headlining boss to industry liability. From a name on a marquee to a risk notation on a spreadsheet. From a brand to a warning label in a Monday morning risk review. That is not interpretation. That is the documented timeline. That is what 6 hours of Curtis Jackson's corporate influence looked like playing out in the open marketplace. Curtis Jackson took his public victory lap on camera. He always does. And this time the lap was nothing short of cinematic. A photograph. Curtis Jackson seated at the head of a long mahogany conference table. 6 executives in tailored suits positioned around him. A leather portfolio spread open before him. A single fountain pen resting on the top page like a closing punctuation mark. Caption underneath 7 words, I told y'all I was cleaning house. Then the follow-up post 30 seconds later, nobody is booking the fake boss, labels do not want him, venues do not want him, the bots got flagged, pack it in Ricky, the ride is over. I want you to absorb the precise surgical quality of that language for a moment, not the ride is done. The ride is over, present tense. Declared. Absolute Curtis Jackson was not forecasting Rick Ross's collapse. Curtis Jackson was narrating it as it happened in real time. And the culture, the very same culture that celebrated Rick Ross wearing the title of biggest boss for 15 years, did not come to his defense. It joined in. It joined in aggressively because the optics were nothing short of catastrophic. For a decade and a half, Rick Ross told us he commanded boardrooms. And in a single afternoon, Curtis Jackson showed everyone exactly who actually walked into those rooms, sat at the head of the table, and shut the door behind him. That is not a diss. That is a demotion. And demotions cannot be reversed with a diss track. Let me take you inside the Promised Land estate in Georgia, because what unfolded there over the following hours is the human center of this entire story. Sources connected to Maybach Music Group describe a scene approaching full organizational panic. The road manager was on one line. The distribution representative was on another. Event promoters across 5 states were on hold. The catering vendor for the European leg was asking whether to issue refunds. The insurance carrier on the tour bond was demanding updated capacity projections in writing before close of business. And in the middle of all of it sat Rick Ross himself, silk robe, cigar burning, cell phone in one hand, laptop open in the other, fighting to hold the mythology together while the mythology was actively being repossessed around him. Ross did what Ross always does. He went live. He pulled up Instagram, camera pointed forward, jaw locked tight, and delivered a rant that under any other circumstances would have been legendary. He accused Curtis Jackson of running to white corporate executives to destroy black art. He accused Curtis Jackson of deploying dirty Hollywood maneuvers because Curtis Jackson could not touch him lyrically. He called Curtis Jackson an informant wearing a suit, a line that would have set the internet on fire in a different era. But this era did not care. This era watched a man in a silk robe defending an empire that was already being dismantled behind his back. And that is an extraordinarily difficult visual to recover from. You cannot argue your way out of a repossession by performing more loudly. Now stay with me here because this is the part most creators are going to overlook entirely. The blacklisting was not the story. The blacklisting was the smoke screen. The actual fire had been burning underneath the whole time, and Curtis Jackson ignited it 7 years ago. At 2:30 in the afternoon, an entertainment journalist dropped a bombshell that stopped the entire industry cold. Leaked communications between a senior executive at a major distribution conglomerate and Curtis Jackson's legal team revealed the true mechanism behind the takedown. Curtis Jackson's investment group, a discrete vehicle registered under a chain of corporate shells threading through Delaware, Wyoming, and the Cayman Islands, had spent several years quietly purchasing the distressed debt portfolios of a former distribution partner that Maybach Music Group had signed with in the early 2010s. In the most generous reading of those documents, Curtis Jackson acquired the debt as a passive financial investment. In the most damaging reading, and this is the reading the leaked emails fully support, Curtis Jackson acquired the debt for one reason and one reason only: to position himself not as Rick Ross's rival, but as Rick Ross's legal creditor. And that word matters enormously. A rival can be out-trapped. A rival can be out-toured. A rival can be out-promoted. A creditor can only be paid. And this is precisely where the ground fractures. Because if Curtis Jackson's investment group holds active liens on Rick Ross's original distribution obligations, then every single dollar Rick Ross's new album generates, every stream royalty, every touring settlement, every catalog sync deal, every piece of merchandise sold at the end of a show is legally subject to garnishment the moment it enters Maybach Music's accounting pipeline. Read that again. Rick Ross was not simply losing money on the album. Rick Ross was generating money for Curtis Jackson through the album. Every stream, every playlist advertisement, every arena seat, every ringtone downloaded in a country he never toured. Every single penny. The check was not heading back to the promised land estate in Georgia. The check was crossing town to G-Unit's financial office. And Curtis Jackson understood that before he ever sent the first letter. That is precisely why he sent the first letter. He was not trying to sink the album. He was trying to maximize the garnishment. He wanted every dollar arriving under his name. That is the one sentence that transforms a rivalry into a business model. Curtis Jackson posted the closing punctuation himself. A brief video clip, private jet, champagne flute raised, laughing hard enough to wipe his eyes. I own you, Ricky, I own you. Every time somebody streams a track off that flop, the payment routes to me. Thank you for the 2,000 sales. I will collect my share on Friday. The internet did exactly what the internet does. It converted the catastrophe into memes within 11 minutes. Rick Ross dressed in a G-Unit polo, a name tag reading employee of the month. Rick Ross clocking into a G-Unit corporate office. Rick Ross's Wingstop uniform digitally edited into a G-Unit uniform. A doctored W-2 with Curtis Jackson's signature at the bottom. The biggest boss brand, a label Ross spent 20 years engineering, protecting, and monetizing, was completely dismantled in a single news cycle. And here is the terrifying part. The public dismantling was not the real injury. The public dismantling was the painkiller masking the actual wound. The true financial damage is that Rick Ross now faces a choice between performing the album and not performing it, and both options are losses. Perform and Curtis Jackson collects payment. Decline to perform and the venue overhead and tour bond expenses consume him from the inside. This is what checkmate looks like inside a modern corporate environment. There is no move available that is not already the wrong move. Every square Rick Ross can step onto is a square Curtis Jackson already purchased. Every direction he turns, there is a lien waiting. Every step forward is a garnishment. Every step backward triggers a default. This is the geometry of a corporate elimination, and Curtis Jackson drafted the blueprint. You want to know how a Maybach music strategist described the situation privately? He said it aloud on a phone call with a business affairs attorney at 3:00 in the afternoon, and it leaked within 60 minutes. He said, and I am quoting directly, We are not fighting a rivalry anymore. We are fighting a hostile corporate takeover, and we showed up with a diss track to a debt collection. That single line is going to end up inside a business school curriculum one day. Wharton is going to teach it, and somewhere in the back of that classroom, a 22-year-old with a rap ambition is finally going to understand why the paperwork matters infinitely more than the punchlines, because that sentence captures the entire imbalance perfectly. Rick Ross prepared for a rap war. Curtis Jackson prepared for a corporate war. And the moment those two strategies met in the real marketplace, one of them stopped being a strategy and became a target instead. Rick Ross did not lose this confrontation in 2026. Rick Ross lost this confrontation in 2011 inside a conference room he never set foot in, on a document he never bothered to reread. Now here is where it grows even darker, because Rick Ross's team did precisely what any cornered organization does under pressure. They filed legal action. Late that afternoon, Ross's legal team announced an emergency federal lawsuit alleging tortious interference, predatory corporate harassment, and illegal restraint of trade. They formally requested a federal judge issue an immediate injunction against Curtis Jackson's debt enforcement mechanism. And on paper, that is a reasonable and calculated move. On paper, that is exactly what any competent legal team would do. But paper does not know Curtis Jackson. Paper cannot alert you. Paper cannot hesitate. Paper only reflects what it was written to reflect, and Curtis Jackson's paper was composed by attorneys who have been silently preparing for exactly this type of filing for years. Because Curtis Jackson's legal counsel replied with one sentence, just one. And that single sentence paralyzed the entire Maybach music war room. Quote, "We welcome the litigation as discovery will require Rick Ross to submit 10 years of unedited tax returns and offshore financial records under penalty of perjury." Let that sentence settle inside your chest for a moment, because that sentence is not a legal response. That sentence is a nuclear deterrent. Curtis Jackson is not declaring that they will defeat Rick Ross in court. Curtis Jackson is declaring that they will open Rick Ross's financial books in court, and everything he spent 20 years concealing will become part of the public record. For a man whose entire brand is constructed on the perceived magnitude of his personal wealth, legal discovery is not a financial risk. Discovery is an existential threat. If those tax returns reveal what the industry has quietly whispered about for a decade, that the promised land estate carries enormous debt, that the Wingstop franchises are running on borrowed time, that the private jet is a lease agreement, that the offshore accounts do not reflect what representatives have long claimed, then Rick Ross does not simply lose a lawsuit. Rick Ross loses the mythology entirely. And in hip-hop, the mythology is the collateral. There is no path back from a discovered bank statement. Because the moment those documents reach the court docket, they reach the internet, and every A&R executive, every promoter, every festival buyer begins pricing Rick Ross the way you price a used vehicle with a compromised title history. All right, family, breathe for a second, because we are about to discuss the element that transforms this from a hostile financial siege into a full historic corporate hostile takeover. This is the piece that is going to keep music attorneys awake for the next 6 months straight. At 5:45 Eastern this afternoon, a corporate registry filing emerged from the state of Florida. A newly formed investment group, organized under a Delaware LLC, with a registered agent in Tallahassee and filing counsel based in Miami, submitted a formal acquisition offer for the complete Maybach Music Group trademark portfolio and catalog rights. The filing declares that the investment group has already secured a controlling position in Maybach Music's underlying debt obligations from a combination of institutional lenders and secondary market debt purchasers. And if Rick Ross defaults on his approaching liability payments, which given the tour suspension and the streaming audit is not a distant possibility, but rather an imminent Tuesday, the investment group is positioned to convert that debt directly into equity. Ownership, brand identity, catalog, master recordings, the entire operation, the complete ecosystem, the full 17-year narrative priced at whatever number appears on a foreclosure docket. And I want you to sit with that valuation for a genuine moment, because the number on a foreclosure docket is never the number the artist believes his empire deserves. The person surrendering assets is never present in the negotiation room. The person acquiring them is never operating from emotion. And the final price is always lower than the mythology suggested it would be. Read the next detail carefully, because this is precisely where the room goes completely silent. The principal managing director listed on the corporate filing is a senior corporate attorney whose primary role is chief legal counsel at G-Unit Film and Television, which means the entity pursuing Maybach Music is not a neutral passive investor. The entity pursuing Maybach Music is a strategic acquisition arm directly connected to Curtis Jackson's personal corporate structure. Curtis Jackson is not simply blacklisting Rick Ross from the music industry. Curtis Jackson is attempting to legally purchase the very empire that created Rick Ross as a cultural phenomenon. If the acquisition closes, and given the debt position, the timing, and the venue collapse, that possibility requires very little effort on Curtis Jackson's part. He will own the Maybach Music Group name, the entire back catalog, the master recording rights, and by extension the complete branding infrastructure behind everything Rick Ross has released since 2009. He will own the logo, he will own the trademark, he will own the tour identity. I want you to sit with the full moral weight of that for a moment. Rick Ross's name is not simply an artist moniker. The Rick Ross brand is an entire ecosystem. Meek Mill built his career inside that ecosystem. Whale built his career inside that ecosystem. Stolly, Amarian, Rocky Fresh, an entire generation of artists channeled their professional paths through the Maybach Music brand. And if Curtis Jackson controls the trademark, Curtis Jackson holds the branding rights over every project stamped with that logo, reaching all the way back through history. And this is precisely where the industry began quietly invoking the word that no executive wants to speak aloud: precedent. Because if this succeeds, and it is succeeding, then the template for a corporate hostile takeover of a hip-hop label has just been validated. It now has a documented case study attached to it. And every legacy artist carrying a leveraged catalog just felt a cold breeze sweep across the back of their neck. Now hold on. I want to give the opposing argument its complete and proper space, because you deserve to hear both sides fully. There is a legitimate camp, a genuinely serious camp and not a trolling camp, that argues Curtis Jackson has weaponized private financial capital in a manner that threatens every independent black-owned label operating in the music business today. If a media mogul can quietly acquire the distressed debt of a rival, engineer a very public revenue collapse, and then convert that debt into full ownership at the precise moment of default, then no independent label is truly independent anymore. That is not paranoia speaking. That is Wall Street operating on a familiar 40-year playbook. What is entirely new is watching it unfold inside hip-hop culture in real time, with the architect providing live commentary from a private jet while holding a champagne flute. And whether you celebrate it or condemn it, you are forced to acknowledge the fundamental shift that just occurred. This is not the same industry it was on Monday morning. Something foundational moved, and foundational movements do not reverse themselves. This is the distinction between a difficult news cycle and a genuine paradigm shift. A difficult news cycle eventually heals. A paradigm shift permanently rewrites the operating manual. The opposing camp, Team Curtis Jackson, which is a substantial camp, argues something entirely different. They argue this outcome was earned through discipline and patience. They argue Rick Ross had 17 years to sharpen his corporate understanding the way Curtis Jackson sharpened his, and instead chose to invest that time in sharpening his lifestyle presentation. They argue that celebrating ownership on record for a decade and a half without actually holding structural equity is precisely the kind of performance costume that eventually gets torn off inside a real boardroom. They argue that Curtis Jackson did not manipulate the system. Curtis Jackson simply learned to read it with greater precision. And the gap between reading the game and being read by it is the gap between owning your masters and discovering your masters were used as collateral by a partner you forgot signing with back in 2011. Both camps make valid arguments within their own frameworks. Both camps simultaneously miss the deeper narrative, because the deeper narrative is not Curtis Jackson versus Rick Ross. The deeper narrative is that hip-hop just crossed a permanent threshold. For 30 years, the culture operated on the belief that rivalries were resolved through lyrics, that respect was earned through catalog, and that legacy was measured by cultural influence. In a single afternoon, Curtis Jackson demonstrated that the currency has fundamentally changed. The currency is no longer lyrics. The currency is corporate leverage. And if you have not been constructing it quietly over time, you simply do not possess it. And if you do not possess it, then a man who has been building it in complete silence for a decade can appear at your front door carrying a financial portfolio, a warm smile, a legal stamp, and an attorney, and you will have absolutely no countermove available. You will have no ally in the room to make a saving call because the person who owns the room is the person who purchased the room. And Curtis Jackson has been quietly acquiring rooms since the vitamin water transaction closed in 2007. Let me bring you back inside the promised land estate for one final scene, because sources are reporting on the atmosphere at the compound as of the last 2 hours. Rick Ross has gone completely silent. The Instagram live sessions have ceased. The silk robe monologues have come to a full stop. The team is locked inside a closed-door meeting with 2 law firms, one focused on civil matters and one operating adjacent to criminal territory, reviewing whether any procedural path exists to block Curtis Jackson's investment vehicle before the trademark filing advances to its next hearing window. There is discussion of a preliminary injunction. There is discussion of an emergency federal motion. There is discussion of a settlement negotiation. A settlement coming from a man who has declared for 15 straight years that he does not settle for anything. Meek Mill has been on the phone with the team throughout the entire afternoon. Whale has not issued any public comment. Stolly posted a Bible verse and quietly removed it 40 minutes later. Floyd Mayweather posted a laughing emoji from a yacht, which honestly should be considered a legally significant communication in its own right at this stage. And Curtis Jackson, according to a source embedded within G-Unit, is sleeping with the deep satisfaction of a man who has been patiently waiting 17 years to finally rest this way. You feel the full gravity of that sentence? 17 years. Curtis Jackson did not spend 17 years plotting revenge. Curtis Jackson spent 17 years constructing the infrastructure so that when the defining moment arrived, delivering that consequence would not require sustained effort. It would require only a signature. That is the genuinely terrifying dimension of this entire story. Curtis Jackson did not have to grind today. Curtis Jackson simply had to sign today. The construction work was completed between 2008 and now, conducted quietly, away from cameras, away from the podcast circuit, away from the diss track cycle. And the reason no one identified it approaching is because Curtis Jackson does not narrate his construction phase publicly. Curtis Jackson only narrates the demolition phase, and by the time the narration commences, the structure is already reduced to rubble. That is not fortune. That is a carefully developed doctrine, and doctrines, unlike personal rivalries, scale across targets. Doctrines get applied to the next target, and the one after that, and the one after that. And this is where the ground fractures for the second time tonight, because a second collection of documents has emerged in the last 90 minutes, and I am watching this develop in real time as I record, indicating that Curtis Jackson's investment group has also entered preliminary discussions with a major streaming platform regarding a licensing renegotiation covering the entire Maybach music back catalog. That renegotiation, if completed, would restructure the royalty flow on every historic Rick Ross album released under the label, from Trilla all the way to Rich Forever, Mastermind, and Port of Miami under entirely new ownership terms. In plain, straightforward language, Curtis Jackson is not merely attempting to purchase the label. Curtis Jackson is attempting to retitle the complete historical catalog. Every song ever released, every guest appearance, every hook Whale contributed. Every bar Meek Mill delivered under that logo. Every ad-lib Ross buried deep inside a mixdown in a Fort Lauderdale recording studio 12 years ago. If that renegotiation finalizes, the entire commercial legacy of Maybach Music Group would be listed under a Curtis Jackson-controlled entity. And that is not a hostile takeover in the traditional sense. That is a complete rewriting of the historical record. That is Curtis Jackson editing the credits on a 20-year creative run and inscribing his own name across the closing frame. Drop your perspective in the thread below because the culture is genuinely fractured on this one, and I want to hear exactly where you stand. Is Curtis Jackson the most strategically calculated executive hip-hop has ever witnessed? Is Rick Ross the cautionary tale that results from speaking the language of ownership without ever truly building it? Is this the moment private capital finally cracked open the last genuinely independent corner of the music business? Or is this, and this is the argument I want you to bring powerfully into the comments, is this the long overdue receipt Curtis Jackson has been owed since 2008, finally delivered with the surgical precision of a man who grasped that the loudest form of revenge is the kind that arrives inside a manila envelope? I want your genuine take. I want the unfiltered version, not the carefully considered public take, but the one you would voice on the phone to your most trusted friend at midnight. That is the specific one I want inside this thread. Now let me address the question I already know you are typing right now because I can see the comment section responding in real time. You are asking whether Rick Ross can realistically survive this, and I owe you complete honesty rather than comfortable spin. Financially, Rick Ross does possess assets. He holds real estate. He operates franchise businesses. He maintains income streams existing entirely outside the Maybach music trademark. He is not a destitute man, but here is the structural trapdoor Rick Ross fell directly through this week, and nobody on his team carries a ladder long enough to pull him back out. Let me expand the frame one final time because the historical parallel deserves its proper place in this conversation. There is precisely one other moment in hip-hop history that approaches what we are currently witnessing. In the mid-2000s, when Master P observed his no-limit empire being consumed by distribution disputes and mounting tax liens, the broader culture labeled it a personal failure on his part. It was not a personal failure at all. It was a structural failure. Master P constructed a brand at a pace that outran the corporate framework required to sustain it, and when the framework finally collapsed, the brand collapsed alongside it. Curtis Jackson watched that entire process unfold in real time as a developing young artist finding his footing. Curtis Jackson absorbed those lessons with precision. Curtis Jackson extracted the exact lesson the broader industry hoped no one would internalize, that the death of a rap empire is almost never caused by the music itself. It is almost always caused by the paperwork. And Curtis Jackson has spent 2 decades reverse engineering that lesson into a deployable weapon. What you are observing this week is not a personal rivalry reaching its dramatic conclusion. What you are observing this week is Curtis Jackson delivering the fully realized version of a thesis he first began drafting in the year 2003. There is one final piece I must share with you before we bring this to a close, and this piece fundamentally reframes what you believed this entire video was about. Because up until this precise moment, the narrative has been framed as Curtis Jackson versus Rick Ross. That framing is incomplete. The complete story is that Curtis Jackson has just authored the operational playbook for the next decade of hip-hop corporate maneuvering, and every executive sitting inside every major label is downloading and studying that playbook right now. Sources at 2 competing major labels confirmed privately that internal memos circulated this evening directing legal departments to conduct full audits of their exposure to legacy artist catalogs currently held under co-signed distribution agreements. Read that sentence carefully twice. Because what that memo communicates in plain everyday language is this: determine who owes what to whom, and determine whether Curtis Jackson's approach could be executed against your own artists as well. Curtis Jackson did not simply dismantle Rick Ross. Curtis Jackson demonstrated to the entire industry that this type of dismantling was architecturally possible. And there are no fewer than 8 legacy artists. I will not identify them tonight, but I will name every single one in the next breakdown, whose catalog structure bears a striking resemblance to what Rick Ross's situation looked like on Monday morning. 8 individuals who were sleeping soundly just days ago. 8 individuals who are not sleeping tonight. 8 individuals whose attorneys are composing the same emergency legal memorandum that Rick Ross's attorneys were drafting just 6 hours ago. And here is the dimension of this story that should send a genuine chill straight through you. Because I have spent the last 3 hours on the phone with people I trust completely, and every single one of them communicated the identical message to me using different words. This was never fundamentally about Rick Ross. Rick Ross was the live demonstration. Rick Ross was the pilot episode proving the concept. Rick Ross was Curtis Jackson establishing proof of principle before a room full of investors who now possess a working case study, a replicable template, and a validated model. And once a template exists and is proven, you do not stop at one application. You stop only when the available targets are exhausted. Which means the coming 12 months inside this industry are not going to resemble the past 12 months in any recognizable way. The next 12 months are going to unfold like an entire season of a corporate crime drama that Curtis Jackson himself would be credited as executive producer. Because in a very real sense, he already is. All right, family, we are bringing this in for a landing, but stay with me for just 30 more seconds. Because what develops over the next 72 hours is going to be absolutely everything. If a federal judge approves the injunction Rick Ross's team filed this afternoon, the entire debt garnishment mechanism gets suspended, and Curtis Jackson is forced to decelerate. If the judge rejects the injunction, the trademark acquisition window opens immediately, and the Maybach Music Group name transfers ownership before the close of the current fiscal quarter. That is the fork in the road. 2 outcomes. One binary ruling from a single federal judge sitting in a Florida courtroom. And whichever direction that ruling lands, the resulting shockwave impacts every catalog owner operating in this business today. Do not allow anyone to persuade you otherwise. Do not allow a single other content creator to frame this moment as a personal rap rivalry, because that framing is a deliberate lie by omission. This is a leveraged financial acquisition wearing the clothing of a rap feud. That has been the entire deception from the beginning. That has always been the complete trick. Hit that subscribe button right now because this story is not slowing down for anyone. Enable your notifications immediately because sources are reporting the injunction hearing is expected sometime within the next 48 to 72 hours, and I will not rest until I have that ruling in my hands the moment it is issued. I am tracking this in real time. I have sources positioned inside 3 of the parent companies involved. I have sources inside 2 of the legal firms handling this matter. I have a contact who staffed the catering at the venue where the emergency Maybach meeting was held tonight, and I know the precise time the last vehicle departed that parking lot. The instant the courtroom moves, Fame Spot moves with it. Part 2 of this full breakdown is already deep in production. Part 2 is where I identify each of those 8 legacy artists whose catalogs may be positioned as the next targets. Part 2 is where I methodically dismantle the offshore corporate architecture that Curtis Jackson's investment vehicle is actually constructed upon. Layer by layer, entity by entity, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. Part 2 is where I present you with the specific 7-page contract clause from 2011 that made every single element of this scenario legally possible. Because once you see the complete diagram laid out before you, you are going to understand with absolute clarity that this was never a rivalry, and this was never going to conclude as anything other than exactly this. Drop your verdict in the thread right now. Did Curtis Jackson finally deliver the 17-year receipt the culture has debated for years? Or did he simply weaponize private financial capital against black-owned music in a manner we are all going to deeply regret over time? Did Rick Ross genuinely deserve this outcome, or did the culture just witness a carefully staged public execution disguised as a rap rivalry? Did the industry get fully exposed for its vulnerabilities, or did it just receive the most expensive education it has ever been handed? I am reading every comment posted tonight. I am personally responding to the sharpest and most original perspectives submitted. Tell me who wins in the end. Tell me who ultimately loses. Tell me what becomes of a culture that just watched one man purchase his rival's entire empire and place his own name above the entrance. Because whatever answer you believe is correct right now, I give you my word that the actual truth is going to prove uglier, sharper, and more historically significant than anything this business has witnessed in the past 20 years. And Fame Spot will be the voice delivering it to you the moment it arrives. Stay locked in, stay sharp, stay skeptical. And whatever you do, do not look away. Because in this particular industry, the moment you look away is the precise moment the empire transfers ownership. The boss quietly becomes an employee, and the 17-year receipt finally gets stamped with one word: paid.